Chapters 1 to 3 of Book 9 of Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Robert Kuiper. Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo, translated by Elizabeth Florence Hapgood. Book 9, Whither Are They Going? Chapters 1 to 3. Chapter 1. Jean Valjean. That same day, towards 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Jean Valjean was sitting alone on the back side of one of the most solitary slopes in the Champ de Mars. Either from prudence or from a desire to meditate, or simply in consequence of one of those insensible changes of habit which gradually introduce themselves into the existence of everyone, he now rarely went out with Cosette. He had on his workman's waistcoat and trousers of gray linen, and his long visored cap concealed his countenance. He was calm and happy now beside Cosette. That which had for a time alarmed and troubled him had been dissipated. But for the last week or two anxieties of another nature had come up. One day, while walking on the boulevard, he had caught sight of Thénardier. Thanks to his disguise, Thénardier had not recognized him. But since that day, Jean Valjean had seen him repeatedly, and he was now certain that Thénardier was prowling about in their neighborhood. This had been sufficient to make him come to a decision. Moreover, Paris was not tranquil. Political troubles presented this inconvenient feature for anyone who had anything to conceal in his life, that the police had grown very uneasy and very suspicious, and that while seeking to ferret out a man like Pépin or Maury, they might very readily discover a man like Jean Valjean. Jean Valjean had made up his mind to quit Paris and even France, and go over to England. He had warned Cosette. He wished to set out before the end of the week. He had seated himself on the slope in the Champ de Mars, turning over all sorts of thoughts in his mind. Thénardier, the police, the journey, and the difficulty of procuring a passport. He was troubled from all these points of view. Last of all, an inexplicable circumstance, which had just attracted his attention and from which he had not yet recovered, had added to his state of alarm. On the morning of that very day, when he alone of the household was stirring, while strolling in the garden before Cosette's shutters were open, he had suddenly perceived on the wall the following line engraved, probably with a nail: 16 Rue de la Verrerie. This was perfectly fresh. The grooves in the ancient black mortar were white. A tuft of nettles at the foot of the wall was powdered with a fine, fresh plaster. This had probably been written on the preceding night. What was this? A signal for others, a warning for himself? In any case, it was evident that the garden had been violated and that strangers had made their way into it. He recalled the odd incidents which had already alarmed the household. His mind was now filled with this canvas. He took good care not to speak to Cosette of the line written on the wall, for fear of alarming her. In the midst of his preoccupations, he perceived from a shadow cast by the sun that some one had halted on the crest of the slope immediately behind him. He was on the point of turning round when a paper folded in four fell upon his knees as though a hand had dropped it over his head. He took the paper, unfolded it, and read these words written in large characters with a pencil: "Move away from your house." Jean Valjean sprang hastily to his feet. There was no one on the slope. He gazed all around him and perceived a creature larger than a child, not so large as a man, clad in a gray blouse and trousers of dust-colored cotton velvet, who was jumping over the parapet and who slipped into the moat of the Champ de Mars. Jean Valjean returned home at once in a very thoughtful mood. Chapter 2. Marius. Marius had left M. Gillenormand in despair. He had entered the house with very little hope, and quitted it with immense despair. However, and those who have observed the depths of the human heart will understand this. The officer, the lancer, the ninny, Cousin Théodule, had left no trace in his mind, not the slightest. The dramatic poet might apparently expect some complications from this revelation made point blank by the grandfather to the grandson, but what the drama would gain thereby, truth would lose. Marius was at an age when one believes nothing in the line of evil. Later on comes the age when one believes everything. Suspicions are nothing else than wrinkles. Early youth has none of them. That which overwhelmed Othello glides innocuous over Candide. Suspect Cosette? There are hosts of crimes which Marius could sooner have committed. He began to wander about the streets, the resource of those who suffer. He thought of nothing so far as he could afterwards remember. At 2 o'clock in the morning he returned to Courfeyrac's quarters and flung himself, without undressing, on his mattress. The sun was shining brightly when he sank into that frightful leaden slumber which permits ideas to go and come in the brain. When he awoke, he saw Courfeyrac, Enjolras, Feuillet, and Combeferre standing in the room with their hats on and all ready to go out. Courfeyrac said to him: "Are you coming to General Lamarque's funeral?" It seemed to him that Courfeyrac was speaking Chinese. He went out some time after them. He put in his pocket the pistols which Javert had given him at the time of the adventure on the 3rd of February, and which had remained in his hands. These pistols were still loaded. It would be difficult to say what vague thought he had in his mind when he took them with him. All day long he prowled about without knowing where he was going. It rained at times. He did not perceive it. For his dinner he purchased a penny roll at a baker's, put it in his pocket, and forgot it. It appears that he took a bath in the Seine without being aware of it. There are moments when a man has a furnace within his skull. Marius was passing through one of those moments. He no longer hoped for anything, this step he had taken since the preceding evening. He waited for night with feverish impatience. He had but one idea clearly before his mind. This was, that at 9 o'clock he should see Cosette. This last happiness now constituted his whole future. After that, gloom. At intervals, as he roamed through the most deserted boulevards, it seemed to him that he heard strange noises in Paris. He thrust his head out of his reverie and said: "Is there fighting on hand?" At nightfall, at 9 o'clock precisely, as he had promised Cosette, he was in the Rue Plumet. When he approached the grating, he forgot everything. It was 48 hours since he had seen Cosette. He was about to behold her once more. Every other thought was effaced, and he felt only a profound and unheard-of joy. Those minutes in which one lives centuries always have this sovereign and wonderful property, that at the moment when they are passing, they fill the heart completely. Marius displaced the bar and rushed headlong into the garden. Cosette was not at the spot where she ordinarily waited for him. He traversed the thicket and approached the recess near the flight of steps. "She is waiting for me there," said he. Cosette was not there. He raised his eyes and saw that the shutters of the house were closed. He made the tour of the garden. The garden was deserted. Then he returned to the house and, rendered senseless by love, intoxicated, terrified, exasperated with grief and uneasiness, like a master who returns home at an evil hour, he tapped on the shutters. He knocked and knocked again, at the risk of seeing the window open and her father's gloomy face make its appearance and demand: "What do you want?" This was nothing in comparison with what he dimly caught a glimpse of. When he had rapped, he lifted up his voice and called: "Cosette! Cosette!" he cried. "Cosette!" he repeated imperiously. There was no reply. All was over. No one in the garden, no one in the house. Marius fixed his despairing eyes on that dismal house, which was as black and silent as a tomb, and far more empty. He gazed at the stone seat on which he had passed so many adorable hours with Cosette. Then he seated himself on the flight of steps, his heart filled with sweetness and resolution.